As we're nearing the end of the module and the assessment is on the horizon, I thought it would be helpful to give you a little mini presentation on the assessment question and to give you a few tips and hints on how you approach it. So, just to remind us what the question is, we are asking you, in no more than 3,000 words, summarise the main governance arrangements arising from a policy issue. Identify the strengths and weaknesses of these governance arrangements in tackling the policy problem. We've given you 4 options to choose from for your policy issue. They are climate change, human rights, peace building and or peacekeeping, and international trade. For this demonstration, I'm going to look at health policy. I didn't want to choose one of the 4 that we've given you, as it would give an unfair advantage to those who have chosen it. So I'm choosing a 5th option, health policy. But this isn't available to you, so please don't answer this question yourself. So, looking at health policy, we're asking you to choose one form of governance that we have discussed in the module to examine your policy issue. So, for example, you can look at global governance, or you can look at state governance, or network governance. Those are the 3 big ones. We'll come back to this a bit later on. So, where do we begin when writing our assessments? The first thing to think about is structure, and we have given you some guidelines for this in the assessment outline. As with every assignment and every piece of writing, we should start with an introduction, which should be about 3,000 words. Then we go on to section 1, defining the term governance and its evolution, which should be about 800 to 900 words. Section 2 is asking you to summarise the main governance arrangements in place to address your chosen policy issue. That should be about 700 to 800 words. Section 3, we're asking you to analyse the strengths and weaknesses of these governance arrangements in addressing the policy issue. That should be 800 to 900 words. And then a conclusion, which should be 300 words. So where do we begin? You would think we would start with the introduction, but we have a top tip. Leave the introduction until the end. The reason for this is that we want the introduction to give a really good overview of the paper. And you can't really know what that paper is going to look like until you've written it, or at least planned it. So good practice to get into, turn it into a habit if you can, is to write the introduction last. So you can include signposting and things like that in your introduction and give a really good overview of what your paper is going to say. So, instead of starting with the introduction, I'm going to start with section 1. Define the term governance and its evolution. So in this section, you need to demonstrate that you know what the concept of governance means and how it has changed over time. This is a really important thing to remember when you're writing assignments. What we want you to do is to demonstrate to the reader or to the marker that you have a really good understanding of the concept that we've been exploring throughout the whole module. So really make sure you plan this section carefully and think of the main points that you want to include so that you do demonstrate that you have a good knowledge and that you understand what governance is. As always, it's important to remember to use the literature and to reference. We'll come back to that later. I would suggest for this section, perhaps using the first half of the section to discuss the definition of governance, and then the second half to describe how it has evolved over time. For this second half, there are perhaps 2 ways of doing it, depending on how you want to look at it. The first is you can look at governance more broadly and how it's evolved, perhaps start at about the 1970s and illustrate how governance has changed, looking at new forms of governance such as new public management and public value management, the move away from the state, the hollowing out of the state, if you like, that sort of thing. I would advise not going previous to the 1970s. If you go too far back in time, you won't really have enough time or space to have a good discussion. So start at about the 1970s if you want to take that approach. Alternatively, if you're on the MPA for International Development, you might want to take more of an angle that looks at governance in international development discourse. So you can look at how the concept has evolved in development studies. So for this, you would perhaps start in the 1980s and the emergence of the good governance agenda and see how that has evolved over time. There are some similar themes to the first option where we look at governance more broadly. So either of those options would be a good way of looking at how governance has evolved over time. Either is fine, it's completely up to you, as long as you use this discussion to demonstrate some of the key aspects of governance and how thinking and practice about it has changed over time. So that's section 1. Now let's look at section 2. This is where our chosen policy comes in. So, as I've chosen health policy, as I explained earlier, I need to think of either a global governance arrangement, a state governance arrangement, or a network governance arrangement for health. So, option 1, if I was to choose global governance to look at. If I were to do that, I might look at, say, the World Health Organization, as that's a global institution that looks specifically at health. If I was doing option 2, and looking at a state governance arrangement, I might look at my home country, the UK, and the state arrangements for healthcare that are available there, specifically the National Health Service. Alternatively, I might look at the US system of healthcare, as I know a bit about that. You can choose any state you like. It might be your home state, it might be a country where you've worked, or a country that you just know a bit about, like I do the US system. It's completely up to you. Just choose a state that you're comfortable with if you're choosing option 2. Option 3, for network governance, I could look at my home state again. For example, at new public-private health arrangements that have popped up in the UK through network governance. Alternatively, I might look a bit at NGO delivery of healthcare in a development context, because I know a bit about that, and apply network governance to those instances. Either is fine again, and both are examples of network governance. Just make sure you choose one that you know and are comfortable with, or that you find interesting. So, when you have chosen your governance arrangement, in this section we want you to summarise it. How does this arrangement work? Who is in charge? What power does it have? How is it operationalised? So my tip for this section would be to pretend you're explaining to someone who knows nothing about that governance arrangement how it works. So in this section, if I was to choose option 1 and look at the World Health Organization, this is just describe what it does, how it works, where its power lies, how it interacts with states, how it interacts with other international organisations, just to give an understanding that you know about how that governance system works. Once you've done that, we move on to section 3, which is where the analysis begins. This is the section where we really want you to apply the theory that we've discussed and critiqued throughout the module to your policy issue and governance arrangement. So, for example, let's look at my example of global governance, the World Health Organization. If you remember earlier in the module, we had a great debate about global governance. So all the points that came up in that debate about legitimacy, about accountability, about effectiveness, all those sorts of things, we want you to apply those points to your policy issue. At the most basic level, we want you to look at the pros and cons of these governance arrangements. Again, bringing in these points that we discussed in the debate, legitimacy, that sort of thing. You can use examples if you want to. For example, in my exploration of the World Health Organization, I might want to make the point that health is a global issue that crosses national borders, and therefore we need a global institution in order to address these policy issues. So I could use the Ebola crisis to illustrate that as an example of the efficiency of a global organisation as opposed to a state or networked organisation to address crises that cross national borders. On the other hand, I could also use, for an example, for the World Health Organization, the frameworks that they come up with for health. One of the most famous of these is the framework for tobacco control, for example, where the World Health Organization comes up with a set of guidelines for countries to adopt to ensure that the health crisis brought about by smoking is reduced. I could use this as an example to illustrate a weakness in global governance. Because although the World Health Organization releases these guidelines and countries sign up to them, the health organization itself has no power to enforce them. There's no sort of global mechanism to make sure that countries abide by these guidelines and policies. So that can demonstrate the point that global governance can be weak, as they are difficult to enforce. So this demonstrates the kind of thing we're looking for in this analysis. There are pros and cons to each mode of governance, and we would like you to critically examine them to demonstrate that you understand the complexities of addressing the policy issues. Let's very quickly have a look at state governance and network governance, how I would do this for health policy. If I was looking at the NHS in the UK as an example of state governance, I would say that a pro, for example, is that there are strong accountability mechanisms throughout the democratic process, because those who are in charge of the NHS, those who are in charge of health policy, are held accountable by the British voting public and the media and the democratic process more broadly, and free speech. However, on the other hand, there are weaknesses to state control of this policy. For those of you who are British or know about the British system, you'll know that the NHS is suffering a bit of a crisis at the moment. There are many people pushing for privatisation of the system, as they claim that state control, state governance in terms of health policy is not effective. So I could explore that a little bit. For network governance, same thing. If I'm looking at the example of NGO delivery of healthcare in a developing context, I can look at the pros. They can be great, the NGOs can be experts in their policy area, they can respond rapidly to crises, and they can fill governance gaps where the state is unable to deliver. They also provide opportunities for citizens to become more involved in the process of policy, as we've discussed in the module. But there are also problems. Who are NGOs and CSOs? Who are they accountable to? Are they accountable to the people that they're trying to help, or are they accountable to the people who fund them? Talking about funding, where does the money come from? And are they effective in providing healthcare to everyone in the way that state governance, for example, the NHS does? Or is their coverage patchy? So hopefully these examples have demonstrated to you the kinds of things we're looking for. We really want you to apply the knowledge and the theory you've acquired about governance to really critique a particular policy issue and governance arrangement in section 3. So once you have done the meat of your assignment, sections 1, 2 and 3, we come on to the conclusion. So to write the conclusion, you need to ask yourself the question, what have I demonstrated in this paper? So hopefully you will have demonstrated that governance is a complex subject, and you'll have demonstrated this by covering the main debates and definitions in section 1. Summarise those here so that the reader remembers. You will have then gone on to look at one particular governance arrangement for your chosen policy issue. And through your analysis in section 3, you will have demonstrated, I've put here ... because that depends on what you've demonstrated. Just recap whatever your main points were in section 3. So at this point, we go back to the beginning. Let's go back and write the introduction. We're in a good position to do this now, as by this point you should hopefully have a full paper that is well structured and you have fleshed out the main points that you want to make. So begin your introduction with a few sentences summarising governance and why it is an important concept. Then give the reader some details of how you are going to address the question by briefly summarising what you are going to say in sections 1, 2 and 3. And finally, how are you going to conclude your paper? I've got another top tip for you here. What I always do when I'm thinking about writing an introduction is I go and look at some academic papers and academic journals to remind me what does a good introduction look like? What does a good overview look like? Academic authors will give an overview or reason for their paper, and give you a bit of background information. Then they will give you an outline of how they will approach it. This is what we're looking for here, so get some tips from the writings of academic authors that you like on how to introduce your work well. So that brings us to the end of the main content. I'm going to give you just a few more top tips to remind you of good essay writing practice. First one of the most important, is referencing. It's so important, it's really worth taking some extra time to get right. Reference throughout your piece of writing, even in the introduction and conclusion if necessary. Substantiate every claim you make with a reference. Don't say something unless you can back it up with evidence from the literature. Your reference material should be academic journals or books, or maybe think tank pieces. We don't want at master's level, we don't want any dictionary definitions, we don't want newspaper sources. We want to make sure that you really know the academic literature, so stick to that for your referencing. Point 2, your bibliography. Bibliography is also really important. Make sure it is neat, make sure it is formatted correctly in the Harvard style, and that it is in alphabetical order. Really valuable marks can be lost in the bibliography, so make sure, again, you really take care over it. Number 3, proofreading. Again, loads of marks can be lost here. Proofread your work carefully to make sure it makes sense and that you have minimised the amount of spelling or grammar errors in your work. Number 4, paragraph structure. This is a common area where people often lose marks. Make sure your paragraphs are really structured well. For example, they should never ever just be one sentence long. Each paragraph should address 1 or 2 of the main points that you want to make towards your argument. And that brings us on to my 5th top tip, choosing your points carefully. So governance and the debates around governance, this is a really big topic, and you won't be able to address all the points in the literature or the points even that are relevant to your policy issue. There are just too many, and we don't expect you to. So just pick the main points that you want to make, the ones you think are the most important based on your reading, and choose the top 3 or 4 and analyse them, critique them, interrogate them really carefully. That will get you much better marks than just trying to put everything in that you've read. So that brings us to the end. I hope you found this brief summary useful. If you have any questions, please do get in touch with Kevin or myself. You can post your questions in the module common room, and either Kevin or I will respond. Alternatively, you can get in touch with us over email or via your eFolio. Either way, if you're struggling, if you have queries, please don't hesitate to get in touch. And my final top tip is remember the study skills section in the hub. That is there to help you. Look back at the feedback you got for your first assignment, and if there's a particular area that the marker highlighted as needing improvement, visit the study skills section to get more tips and hints on how to improve in that particular skill. And that's it for me. I'll say goodbye here. Good luck with it, and I look forward to reading your final assignments.